Mason Whitaker always believed that trust was something quiet and steady, like the low hum of a refrigerator in the background of a peaceful home. You rarely noticed it when it was there, but the moment it disappeared, the silence became impossible to ignore. 3 years earlier, Mason met Caleb Rowan on a rainy evening in a crowded bookstore cafe downtown. Mason had been sketching logo concepts on his tablet, trying to meet a design deadline, when Caleb sat at the next table and casually asked if the empty chair beside Mason was taken. Mason remembered glancing up and noticing Caleb's relaxed smile, the kind that made strangers feel like they had known him for years. They started talking about nothing important at first: music, bad coffee, the weather, but the conversation moved easily, almost naturally. Caleb had a confident warmth that made Mason feel comfortable opening up. By the time the rain stopped, they had exchanged numbers and promises to meet again. That second meeting turned into a third, and before long Caleb was spending nights at Mason's apartment. The relationship unfolded quickly but never felt rushed. Caleb worked as a fitness trainer at a busy gym across town, while Mason spent most of his time designing marketing graphics for small businesses from his laptop. Their schedules were different, yet somehow they always found time to meet in the evenings. At first, everything felt balanced. Caleb brought energy into Mason's quiet routine. Mason brought stability into Caleb's restless lifestyle. Friends often said they complemented each other perfectly, and Mason liked believing that was true. They eventually moved into a small apartment together on the fourth floor of a brick building overlooking a narrow city street. It wasn't glamorous, but it had tall windows and enough sunlight to make the living room feel warm in the afternoons. Mason filled the shelves with books and art supplies, while Caleb added small gym equipment in the corner and insisted on buying plants he often forgot to water. Their life settled into comfortable habits. Mason worked late on design projects while Caleb returned home from the gym smelling faintly of detergent and energy drinks. They cooked simple dinners together and watched old movies on weekends, but Caleb had always been the kind of person who attracted attention without trying. At the gym, clients laughed easily around him. Strangers often struck up conversations. Mason noticed it but never felt threatened. Caleb was open about his life, and he had never given Mason a clear reason to doubt him. That changed the night Adrian Keller appeared. Caleb mentioned Adrian casually one evening while scrolling through his phone on the couch. "Guess who moved back to the city?" Caleb said, glancing up with a grin. Mason looked over from the kitchen counter where he was slicing vegetables. "Who?" "Adrian. We went to college together." The name meant nothing to Mason, but Caleb's excitement was obvious. According to Caleb, Adrian had been one of his closest friends during their university years before moving away to pursue photography. "He's pretty talented," Caleb added. "Travel photography mostly." A few days later, Mason finally met him. Adrian Keller arrived at their apartment carrying a camera bag slung over one shoulder and a polite smile that seemed both warm and distant at the same time. He was slightly older than Mason expected, with observant gray eyes that seemed to study everything in the room before settling into conversation. The three of them spent the evening talking over takeout containers scattered across the coffee table. Adrian told stories about photographing remote landscapes and small coastal towns. Caleb listened with an enthusiasm Mason rarely saw during ordinary conversations. Mason liked Adrian immediately, though he couldn't explain why. Adrian had a calm presence that balanced Caleb's louder personality. Over the following weeks, Adrian began appearing more often. Sometimes Caleb invited him over for dinner. Other times they met at the gym or wandered through the city while Adrian searched for interesting photographs. Mason joined them occasionally, but more often he stayed home finishing work while Caleb texted updates about their outings. At first Mason appreciated that Caleb had reconnected with an old friend, but slowly, almost subtly, the rhythm of their apartment began to change. Caleb checked his phone more frequently. Notifications flashed across the screen while they were eating dinner or watching television. When Mason asked who it was, Caleb would usually answer quickly, "Just Adrian." The tone always sounded casual, yet Mason noticed how Caleb's attention drifted toward the phone even during quiet moments. One Saturday afternoon Adrian stopped by unannounced with a few printed photographs he wanted to show Caleb. Mason was working on his laptop at the dining table while the two of them spread pictures across the living room floor. Mason overheard their laughter and glanced over occasionally. They were leaning close together, studying the images while debating lighting angles and camera settings. At one point Caleb nudged Adrian playfully with his shoulder after losing an argument about composition. The contact lasted only a moment. Still, Mason felt something unfamiliar twist inside his chest that he tried to ignore it. Later that evening, after Adrian left, Mason mentioned it casually while washing dishes. "You two seem to get along really well," he said. Caleb shrugged as if the observation required no explanation. "He's always been like a brother to me." Mason nodded, accepting the answer, but Adrian's visits continued. Sometimes the three of them watched movies together. Sometimes Caleb and Adrian returned from the gym with stories about ridiculous clients or strange workout challenges. Their conversations carried a comfortable familiarity that Mason couldn't quite share. The difference wasn't dramatic, just noticeable. One evening Mason walked into the living room after finishing a design call and found Caleb and Adrian sitting close together on the couch, laughing at something on Adrian's phone. Their shoulders brushed casually as they leaned toward the screen. Adrian said something Mason couldn't hear, and Caleb shoved him lightly with a grin. For a moment neither of them noticed Mason standing in the doorway. When they finally looked up, Caleb smiled easily. "Hey," he said. "You're done working?" Mason stepped into the room slowly. "Yeah." Adrian straightened slightly, though his relaxed smile didn't change. "What are you guys watching?" Mason asked. "Just a dumb video," Caleb replied. Mason sat in the chair across from them, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping into his thoughts. The scene in front of him seemed harmless enough. Friends joked with each other all the time. Still, something about the closeness lingered in his mind. Later that night, after Adrian left, Mason brought it up again while they were getting ready for bed. "You and Adrian seem pretty physical when you joke around," Mason said carefully. Caleb looked genuinely confused for a moment before laughing softly. "Oh, that," he said. "Relax." He reached over and squeezed Mason's hand. "It was just rubbing up," Caleb added casually. "Nothing serious." Mason forced a small smile and nodded, letting the conversation drop. But long after the lights were off and Caleb's breathing settled into sleep beside him, Mason stared at the ceiling in the darkness. The words repeated quietly in his thoughts, "Just rubbing up, nothing serious." For the first time in 3 years, Mason wondered if trust could disappear as quietly as it had arrived. The sentence stayed with Mason Whitaker longer than he expected. At first, he tried to treat Caleb Rowan's explanation as nothing more than a harmless comment. Relationships were built on trust, and Mason had always believed that suspicion could damage something fragile long before any real betrayal occurred. Still, the phrase lingered in the back of his mind like an echo he couldn't silence. "Just rubbing up, nothing serious." Over the next few days, Mason noticed how easily those words resurfaced whenever Caleb's phone buzzed across the table or lit up beside the couch. Each time Caleb glanced at the screen, the same small smile appeared. Quick and unconscious, Mason told himself it was normal. Friends texted each other all the time, yet the rhythm of their apartment had begun to feel slightly unfamiliar. Caleb started coming home later than usual from the gym, sometimes claiming extra clients had asked for extended sessions. Other nights he said Adrian Keller had dropped by unexpectedly and convinced him to stay longer to talk. None of the explanations sounded unreasonable, but Mason began noticing how often Adrian's name appeared in those explanations. One evening Mason sat across from his coworker Ethan Brooks at a quiet coffee shop near their office building. Ethan had insisted Mason step away from work for a break after noticing how distracted he had been during recent design meetings. "You've been staring at your screen like it insulted you personally," Ethan said, stirring sugar into his coffee. Mason forced a faint smile. "Just tired." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That's not the whole story." Mason hesitated before answering. Ethan had always been good at reading people, sometimes too good. "It's Caleb," Mason admitted quietly. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Relationship trouble?" "I don't know if I'd call it trouble," Mason said. "It's just different lately." He explained about Adrian returning to the city and how often Caleb spent time with him now. Mason tried to keep his tone neutral, avoiding accusations that even he wasn't sure were fair. Ethan listened without interrupting. When Mason finished, Ethan shrugged lightly. "Maybe they're just reconnecting," he said. "Old friendships can get intense for a while." "That's what Caleb says," Mason replied, "but..." Mason stared into his coffee. "But I keep feeling like I'm standing outside a conversation that used to include me." Ethan considered that for a moment before speaking carefully. "Then the real question isn't what Caleb is doing," he said. It's why you feel like something's being hidden. Mason didn't have an answer. A few nights later, Mason returned home earlier than usual after finishing a project ahead of schedule. The apartment was quiet when he walked inside, and Caleb's gym bag sat near the door. From the hallway Mason heard voices drifting from the living room. Caleb and Adrian were talking, their conversation sounded relaxed, punctuated by occasional laughter. Mason paused for a moment, debating whether to announce himself or simply walk in. Before he could decide, Adrian spoke again. You know, he notices sometimes, Adrian said. Caleb's reply came after a brief silence. Mason worries too much, Caleb answered. He reads into everything. Mason felt his chest tighten. He cares about you, Adrian said. I know, Caleb replied quietly. The conversation shifted after that, becoming softer, harder to hear. Mason stepped into the room a moment later, pretending he had just arrived. Caleb looked up from the couch with a familiar smile. Oh, hey, he said. You're home early. Adrian sat beside him, holding his camera as if he had been showing Caleb photographs. Finished work faster than expected, Mason said. Neither man looked uncomfortable, yet Mason noticed how the conversation changed immediately after he entered. Whatever they had been discussing moments earlier disappeared behind casual small talk. Adrian stayed for another hour before leaving with a polite wave. After the door closed, Mason watched Caleb scroll through something on his phone. You two seemed deep in conversation when I walked in, Mason said. Caleb glanced up briefly. Just talking about travel plans Adrian might take later this year. Mason nodded slowly. The explanation sounded simple enough, yet Mason couldn't forget the tone in Caleb's voice when he had said Mason worries too much. That night Mason tried to focus on work while Caleb showered in the bathroom. Caleb's phone rested on the coffee table beside the couch, lighting up occasionally with notifications. Normally Mason would have ignored it, but curiosity can grow quietly when left alone too long. The screen lit up again, revealing Adrian's name in a message preview. Mason hesitated before picking up the phone. That he told himself he only wanted reassurance. The first message he saw wasn't dramatic, just a simple line. Adrian, today was fun. Below it Caleb had replied with a laughing emoji. More messages followed, stretching through the afternoon. Adrian describing a photo he wanted Caleb to help recreate, Caleb joking about posing badly in pictures. Then another message appeared farther down the thread. Adrian, you looked good today, Caleb. You say that every time, Adrian. Maybe because it's always true. Mason felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest. The messages weren't explicit. They didn't reveal anything undeniable, but the tone felt different from ordinary friendship. There was a familiarity in the words, a quiet intimacy that Mason recognized immediately. That he placed the phone back on the table just as Caleb walked out of the bathroom drying his hair with a towel. You look serious, Caleb said, noticing Mason's expression. Just thinking, Mason replied. Caleb tossed the towel onto a chair and sat beside him. What about? Mason studied Caleb's face for a long moment. For 3 years he had trusted this man without hesitation. Every memory they shared, late-night conversations, quiet mornings, inside jokes, felt real and important, yet something had shifted. I feel like I'm losing my place in your life, Mason said finally. Caleb frowned slightly. What do you mean? You and Adrian, Mason said. You spend a lot of time together. Caleb leaned back against the couch. He's just a friend, he said. Are you sure that's all it is? The question hung in the air between them. Caleb didn't answer immediately. For the first time since Mason had known him, Caleb looked uncertain. It's not what you think, Caleb said eventually. Mason held his gaze. Then tell me what it is. Caleb opened his mouth as if preparing to respond, but the words didn't come right away, and in that quiet pause, Mason realized something that frightened him more than any confession. Caleb wasn't sure how to explain the truth.